The darkness in Blackwood Hollow was not merely the absence of light. It was a physical weight, a suffocating velvet that pressed against the eyes and filled the lungs with the scent of wet decay and ancient stagnant earth. Elias had been warned, of course. The locals at the Severed Root, the village's only tavern, had gone quiet when he mentioned his intention to walk the old drover's path back to his rental cottage. The bartender, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite and left to weather in a storm, had wiped a glass with slow, deliberate circles and offered a single piece of advice. The woods don't take kindly to strangers after the church bell strikes 12. Stay put, lad. The road changes when the moon looks away. Elias, a man of science and rigid logic, had dismissed the warning with a polite but condescending smile. He was a cartographer, a man whose life was defined by grid lines, coordinates, and the absolute certainty that the world could be measured and mapped. To him, the old drover's path was simply a 3-mile dirt track cutting through the dense forestry, a shortcut that would shave 40 minutes off his journey. Superstition was a luxury for the bored and the uneducated, he reasoned. Now, however, 40 minutes had passed, and the cottage was nowhere in sight. The beam of his flashlight cut a weak, trembling cone through the gloom, illuminating swirling motes of dust and the gnarled, pale roots of trees that seemed to writhe across the path like paralyzed snakes. The air had grown unnaturally cold, a biting chill that seeped through his heavy wool coat and settled deep within his bones. But it was the silence that unnerved him most. It was absolute. There were no crickets, no rustling of nocturnal scavengers, not even the wind in the high branches. It was a vacuum of sound, as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting. Elias checked his watch, bringing his wrist up to the light. The hands stood frozen at 12:15. He frowned, tapping the glass face. He had checked it what felt like an hour ago, and it had read the same time. A mechanical failure, he told himself. Just a coincidence. He picked up his pace, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. The sound was deafening in the stillness, a violent intrusion. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Then he heard it. Crunch, 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 crunch. Elias stopped dead. The extra footstep echoed for a fraction of a second too long, slightly out of sync with his own rhythm. He whipped the flashlight around, the beam slicing through the darkness behind him. "Hello?" His voice cracked, sounding thin and pathetic against the wall of trees. "Is someone there?" Nothing but the looming trunks of oaks and pines, their branches interlaced overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a derelict cathedral. The shadows stretched and warped as he moved the light, creating fleeting illusions of movement in the corner of his eye. He stood there for a full minute, straining his ears until the rushing of his own blood sounded like a roaring river. "Just an echo," he muttered, turning back to the path. "Acoustic anomaly, dense vegetation reflecting sound." He began to walk again, faster this time. He focused on the rhythm. Left, right, left, right. He deliberately varied his pace, taking 2 quick steps and then a long pause. Behind him, the sound mimicked him perfectly. Snap, snap, pause. It wasn't an echo. The timbre was different, heavier, wetter. It sounded like bare feet slapping against mud, not boots on gravel. And it was getting closer. Panic, cold and primal, began to rise in his chest, warring with his rational mind. Elias forced himself not to run. Predators chase things that run. The thought arrived unbidden, a remnant of instinct buried beneath layers of civilization. He gripped the flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned white. The path ahead seemed to be narrowing, the trees pressing in closer, their branches dipping low enough to brush against his hair like skeletal fingers. The fog began to roll in then, not drifting lazily, but surging from the undergrowth, a thick, milky tide that swallowed the ground up to his knees. It distorted the light, scattering the beam into a useless white haze. Elias was now walking in a cloud, unable to see his own feet, guided only by the vague corridor of darker shadows that marked the tree line. He needed to get out. He needed to find the main road. He pulled his phone from his pocket, desperate for the comforting glow of a GPS map. The screen flickered to life, showing no signal. Then, the screen glitching violently, the digital clock spinning rapidly backwards before the device went completely dead, turning into a black brick in his hand. A low, guttural sound vibrated through the air, a sound that was half growl, half giggle. It didn't come from behind him this time. It seemed to come from everywhere, enveloping him. "Who's there?" Elias shouted, abandoning his dignity. "I have a knife." He didn't have a knife. He had a dead phone and a flashlight with fading batteries. As if in response to his lie, the flashlight flickered. Once, twice. The darkness surged in during those brief moments of failure, heavy and oppressive. When the beam stabilized, it was significantly dimmer, casting a sickly yellow glow that barely reached 5 feet ahead. And there, standing at the very edge of the fading light, was a pair of shoes. Elias froze. They were old-fashioned leather boots, caked in mud, standing perfectly still in the middle of the path. He moved the light up slowly, his breath hitching in his throat. There were legs, clad in tattered trousers that looked wet and heavy. He moved the light higher to the torso, expecting a face, a person, perhaps a local, playing a sick prank. But above the waist, there was nothing. The torso simply faded into the fog, or rather, the fog seemed to be the torso, swirling and coalescing into a vague humanoid shape that drifted upward. But where a head should have been, there was only a void, a patch of darkness deeper and more absolute than the night around it. Elias stumbled back, his heel catching on a root, and he fell hard onto the gravel. The flashlight skittered out of his hand, rolling away. The beam spun wildly, illuminating flashes of the scene. A tree trunk, the fog, the empty boots, the darkness. The boots took a step toward him. Elias scrambled backward on his elbows, crab-walking away from the impossible figure. "Stay back!" he screamed. The flashlight rolled to a stop, its beam pointing directly at Elias's face, blinding him. He couldn't see the thing anymore, but he could hear it. The wet, slapping footsteps were accelerating. Slap, slap, slap. He rolled over, scrambling to his feet, and abandoned all logic. He ran. He ran blindly into the suffocating dark, arms outstretched to ward off the trees, branches whipping his face, drawing blood. The air in his lungs burned like ice. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he had to put distance between himself and the thing in the boots. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing against the rough bark of a massive oak tree. He gasped for air, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He listened. Silence. No footsteps, no giggling, just the pounding of his own pulse. He allowed himself a moment of relief, closing his eyes and leaning his head back against the tree. He was lost, yes, but he had outrun it. He just needed to wait for morning. The sun would rise, the fog would lift, and logic would return to the world. Then He felt it. Warm, moist air blew gently against the back of his neck. It wasn't the wind, it was rhythmic, even. Exhale, inhale, exhale. Elias opened his eyes, staring into the abyss before him, paralyzed by a terror so profound it severed the connection between his brain and his limbs. He realized then that he hadn't outrun anything. He hadn't been running away. In the labyrinth of the changing road, he had run exactly where it wanted him to go. A voice, sounding exactly like his own but distorted as if spoken through a mouthful of water, whispered directly into his ear from the other side of the tree trunk. "Found you." The paralysis broke not by courage, but by a primal convulsing revulsion. The sensation of that moist, recycled breath against his neck acted like a live wire against Elias's spine, jolting him forward. He threw himself away from the oak tree, his body hitting the damp earth with a heavy thud, scrambling on hands and knees through the mulch before forcing his trembling legs to bear his weight once more. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The logic that had governed his life, cause and effect, biology, physics, had dissolved into the fog. There was only the hunt. Elias tore through the underbrush, his arms flailing to ward off the unseen sentinels of the forest. Low-hanging branches clawed at his clothes like desperate hands, and brambles tore fresh lacerations into his shins. But the physical pain was distant, muted by the deafening roar of adrenaline in his ears. The woods had changed texture. The ground beneath him was no longer firm soil but a sucking, stagnant mud that threatened to swallow his shoes with every stride, smelling faintly of sulfur and old decay. He expected to hear the heavy, slapping footsteps pursuing him, but the forest offered something far worse, a cacophony of his own making. The sound of his ragged breathing seemed to echo from multiple directions, bouncing off the trees, creating a disorienting surround sound of panic. Then the voice returned. It didn't come from behind him this time. It drifted from the canopy above, wet and gargled, as if the speaker were hanging upside down with a throat full of river water. "Run, Elias! Run home!" He clamped his hands over his ears, stumbling blindly, but the voice bypassed his auditory canals, resonating directly within his skull. Legs hurt, heart hurts, so scared. It was narrating his suffering with a detached, mocking curiosity. It was tasting his fear. Elias veered sharply to the left, sliding down a steep embankment into a ravine choked with mist so thick it tasted like cotton. He needed cover. He needed a place where his back wasn't exposed to the infinite dark. At the bottom of the ravine, the silhouette of a structure loomed out of the gray soup, a jagged, angular shape that didn't belong in nature. Hope, cruel and sharp, pierced his chest. It was a derelict hunting blind, raised on rotting stilts, standing like a skeletal watchman in the gloom. It offered walls. It offered a door. Elias scrambled up the slick wooden ladder, the rungs groaning in protest under his weight. He threw himself onto the small platform and shoved the warped wooden door open, tumbling into the claustrophobic darkness of the small shack. He kicked the door shut and fumbled for the rusted latch, sliding it into place with a metallic clack that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. He collapsed against the far wall, sliding down until he hit the floorboards. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and dry rot, but it was enclosed. He was hidden. He held his breath, straining to listen. Outside, the wind sighed through the ravine, the leaves rustled, but the wet, slapping footsteps had ceased. The mocking voice was silent. Elias exhaled, a long, shuddering release that turned into a sob. He wrapped his arms around his knees, rocking gently. He just had to wait. The night could not last forever. Even in this hellscape, the earth had to turn. The sun would eventually burn away the fog. His eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom inside the shack. Moonlight filtered through the cracks in the wooden planks, painting erratic stripes of silver across the floor. As his heart rate began to decelerate, a new sound intruded upon the sanctuary. It was faint, rhythmic, and coming from the corner of the room directly opposite him. Drip, drip, drip. Elias froze. He told himself it was a leak in the roof. It had to be. He squinted into the shadowed corner. The stripes of moonlight didn't reach that far, leaving a triangular patch of absolute darkness. Drip, drip. It wasn't the erratic rhythm of rain. It was heavy, viscous. Elias reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the cold metal of his lighter, the only tool he had left after losing the flashlight. His thumb trembled violently against the flint wheel. "Please," he begged silently, "let it be water." He struck the wheel. Sparks flew, followed by a small, wavering flame. The feeble light pushed back the shadows, illuminating the small hunting blind. The floorboards were covered in dust, undisturbed for years, except for the center of the room. There, leading from the door he had just latched to the dark corner he was facing, was a trail of wet, muddy footprints. They were large, boot-shaped, and they were fresh. Elias's gaze followed the trail slowly, agonizingly, up to the corner where the dripping sound originated. Huddled in the shadows, crouched in a mockery of a fetal position, was a figure wearing Elias's clothes. It was soaking wet, its skin pale and bloated like a corpse left in the water for weeks. It raised its head, the neck snapping up with a sickening crack. The face was his own, but the eyes were missing, just hollow, dripping sockets of black water. The thing smiled, revealing teeth that were too many and too sharp. The flame in Elias's hand flickered as the creature opened its mouth, and the voice, his voice, spilled out, wet and gurgling. I was already here. The lighter grew too hot to hold, searing his thumb. But Elias couldn't drop it. He couldn't scream. He could only watch as the thing in the corner began to unfold its limbs, rising to block the only exit. The searing heat against his thumb finally shattered the paralysis. The lighter's metal casing had become a brand, scorching his skin, and with a gasp of pain, Elias dropped it. The flame died instantly. Absolute darkness reclaimed the hunting blind, heavier and more suffocating than before. The image of the thing, the wet, bloated simulacrum of himself, burned as an afterimage on his retinas, a neon ghost in the black void. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then came the sound, squelch. It was the sound of wet meat sliding against dry wood. It was moving. Panic, primal and electric, hijacked Elias's nervous system. He didn't think. He reacted. He couldn't go forward. The thing was blocking the door, and he couldn't stay. He threw himself backward, away from the encroaching wetness, his back slamming against the rotting wooden slats of the blind's rear wall. "You can't leave," the voice gurgled from the darkness. It was terrifyingly close now, right in front of him. The voice was his own, but stripped of all warmth, vibrating with the damp echo of a deep well. "We haven't merged!" Elias screamed, a raw, tearing sound, and kicked out with both legs. His boots connected with the brittle, weather-beaten wood of the wall. He felt the planks give way. the rot of decades surrendering to his desperation. With a splintering crack, the wall shattered outward. Momentum carried him through. Elias tumbled out of the blind, falling into the cool night air. He had forgotten the blind was elevated. The fall was short, but brutal. He crashed through a canopy of lower branches that whipped his face like angry lashes before slamming into the forest floor. The impact knocked the wind out of him, leaving him gasping in the dirt, his ribs screaming in protest. The taste of copper filled his mouth. Above him, from the jagged hole in the hunting blind, a silhouette peered down. Backlit by the uncaring moon, the figure looked undeniably human, yet its movements were all wrong. Fluid, boneless, like oil spilling over the edge. Elias scrambled to his feet, ignoring the sharp flare of pain in his ankle. He ran. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he had to put distance between himself and that abomination. The forest, once a place of serene solitude, had transformed into a labyrinth of malice. The trees seemed to close ranks, their roots rising from the earth to snag his boots, their branches reaching down to tear at his clothes. The night was alive with a cacophony of sounds that shouldn't exist. The wind, howling through the pines, sounded like a chorus of whispering voices, all mimicking his name. Elias, Elias. He crashed through a thicket of thorns, the barbs tearing at his jacket and skin, but the physical pain was a grounding anchor against the insanity nipping at his heels. He dared not look back, but he could hear it. Not the heavy thud of boots, but a rhythmic, wet slapping sound against the forest floor. Slap, slap, slap. It was keeping pace with him, effortlessly, relentlessly. His lungs burned as if he were inhaling crushed glass. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the heavy lead of exhaustion. He needed a weapon. He needed light. He needed to wake up. Suddenly, the trees broke. Elias stumbled onto a gravel service road, the pale stones glowing faintly in the moonlight. To his left, about 100 yards down the road, stood a structure, an old ranger station, dark and abandoned, but solid. Salvation. He forced his legs to pump faster, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. The sound of pursuit behind him changed. The wet slapping stopped, replaced by a low, gurgling laughter that seemed to emanate from the air itself. Elias reached the station. It was a small concrete block of a building with a heavy steel door. He threw himself against it, grabbing the cold handle, locked. No, 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 he sobbed, hammering his fist against the metal. He frantically patted his pockets, his mind racing. He had no keys. He had nothing. Then he remembered the loose brick he used to hide a spare key under at his own cabin. Rangers did the same, didn't they? It was a desperate, illogical hope. But he dropped to his knees, clawing at the overgrown grass near the doorframe. His fingers brushed against a fake rock made of plastic. He grabbed it, smashed it against the concrete, and a silver key skittered out. A miracle. Elias snatched the key, his hand shaking so violently he could barely guide it into the lock. From the edge of the woods, the shadows were lengthening, stretching toward him like seeking fingers. A shape was emerging from the tree line, tall, sodden, and wearing his face. The key turned. The tumblers clicked. Elias threw the door open, tumbled inside, and slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt just as a heavy weight impacted the other side. Thud. The steel door vibrated, but it held. Elias collapsed against the far wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. He was in total darkness again, but this was the darkness of safety. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper and dust, not pond water and rot. He hugged his knees to his chest, listening to the wheezing rattle of his own breath. Silence returned to the world outside. No pounding, no screaming. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Elias's heart rate began to slow. He was safe. The steel door was thick. The walls were concrete. He would wait until morning, until the sun burned away this nightmare. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of relief. Then a sound came from the other side of the door, not a pound or a scratch. It was the sound of a key sliding into a lock. Elias's eyes snapped open, widening in the dark. He stopped breathing. The sound was unmistakable. The scrape of metal on metal, the heavy click of tumblers aligning. But that was impossible. He had the key. It was clutched tightly in his sweating palm. The doorknob turned slowly, grinding with rust. Elias scrambled backward, pressing himself into the corner of the room, his mind fracturing. "Who's there?" he croaked, his voice trembling. The door didn't open. Instead, a voice came from the other side, not muffled by the steel, but clear, as if the speaker were standing right next to his ear. It was a voice that sounded calm, rational, and terrifyingly familiar. It was the voice he used when he was trying to soothe a frightened animal. "Elias," the voice said gently, "open the door. You're confused, you're cold, and you're hurt." The knob rattled more violently. "Let me in," the voice continued, dropping an octave, becoming wet and thick. "I can't be whole without the rest of me, and you have something that belongs to us." Elias looked down at his hand. In the sliver of moonlight slicing through the keyhole, he saw what he was actually holding. It wasn't a key, it was a finger, a severed, pale, waterlogged finger with a familiar scar across the knuckle. And the door began to creak open. The severed finger slipped from Elias's grasp, hitting the concrete floor not with the metallic clatter of a key, but with a wet, sickening thud. It lay there in the sliver of moonlight, a pale, accusing grub of flesh pointing back at him. The scar on the knuckle, a jagged white line from a whittling accident when he was 12, gleamed with undeniable, horrifying truth. Elias stared at his own hand. Where his index finger should have been, there was nothing but a smooth, bloodless stump, sealed over as if the digit had never existed, or as if his body had simply decided to erase it. The logic of his anatomy had dissolved, much like the sanity he was desperately trying to cling to. The steel door groaned, the rust shrieking in protest as the heavy barrier swung inward. The stale air of the safe room was instantly annihilated. A wave of stench washed over Elias, the cloying sweet odor of blooming algae, stagnant mud, and meat left too long in the sun. It was the smell of the pond at the bottom of the hill, the place where the neighborhood kids were told never to swim. Elias pressed his back into the corner so hard he felt the rough concrete bite into his skin through his shirt. He wanted to scream, but his throat had constricted into a tight, dry knot. The figure stepped across the threshold. It was Elias, but it wasn't Elias, viewed through the distortion of deep water. The figure's clothes were the same flannel shirt and denim jeans Elias wore, but they were sodden, clinging heavily to a frame that looked bloated and waterlogged. Water dripped steadily from the cuffs of the sleeves and the hem of the pants, creating a dark, spreading pool on the dusty floor. The thing raised its head. Its skin was the color of curdled milk, translucent enough to show the dark network of stagnant veins beneath. Its hair was plastered to its skull in wet, matted ropes, but the eyes were the worst. They were not eyes, they were voids, filled with murky water, devoid of pupils or irises, reflecting nothing but the abyss. "You dropped it," the thing said. The voice didn't come from a throat. It bubbled up from somewhere deep within the torso, wet and gurgling, vibrating the air with a sickening resonance. "We need that to be complete." The creature took a step forward. Its foot squelched, leaving a footprint of black slime. Survival instinct, sharp and primal, finally pierced through Elias's paralysis. If that thing touched him, if that cold, wet flesh made contact with his own, he knew with absolute certainty that he would cease to be. He would become just another drop in the pond. "Stay back!" Elias screamed, his voice cracking. "Why do you run from yourself?" The wet thing gurgled, tilting its head with a jerky, unnatural motion like a marionette with tangled strings. "It's lonely in the deep. It's so cold without the skin." It lunged. The movement was surprisingly fast for something so bloated. Elias threw himself to the left, diving toward the gap between the creature and the door frame. As he scrambled past, his shoulder brushed against the entity's outstretched arm. It was like brushing against a bag of crushed ice wrapped in velvet. The cold burned through his clothes, searing his skin with a frostbite chill that instantly numbed his entire left side. Elias tumbled out of the room, his knees scraping against the gravel outside. He didn't look back. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the phantom freezing sensation radiating from his shoulder, and sprinted into the night. The darkness outside was no longer passive. The night had changed while he was hiding. The mist had thickened into a suffocating blanket, swirling around his ankles like grasping, ghostly hands. The trees, usually familiar sentinels of his property, now loomed like twisted skeletal figures, their branches interlacing to blot out the moon. He ran blindly, his boots pounding the dirt path leading toward the main road. His lungs burned, but the air he inhaled felt thick and humid, tasting of copper and mud. Thump squelch, thump squelch. Behind him, the heavy, wet footsteps were pursuing. They didn't sound frantic. They sounded inevitable. A rhythmic, watery march that seemed to be getting closer with every stride, despite Elias's desperate sprint. "Help!" he shouted, the word torn from his raw throat. "Someone, please!" But the woods absorbed his voice, swallowing the sound instantly. There were no crickets, no owls, just the sound of his own ragged breathing and the wet pursuit behind him. He saw the gate ahead, the iron boundary of his property. Beyond it lay the asphalt road and, hopefully, a passing car. A light. Safety. Elias pushed his body to the limit, his legs pumping furiously. He reached the gate, his hands grasping the cold iron bars to vault over, but as his hands touched the metal, he stopped. The iron wasn't cold. It was wet, and it was soft. Elias recoiled, looking at the gate. The bars were not metal. They were made of gray, fibrous bone, coated in a thick layer of translucent slime. He looked down at the ground. The gravel driveway had vanished, replaced by a squelching carpet of sodden moss and decaying leaves that seemed to pulse gently beneath his feet. The world was rewriting itself. The rot from the pond wasn't just invading, it was overriding reality. He spun around, back to the way he came, but the house was gone. The concrete bunker was gone. There was only the endless fog-choked forest and the silhouette of the bloated thing standing 10 yards away. The creature wasn't chasing him anymore. It was waiting. It raised its hand, the hand that was missing a finger. It pointed at Elias. "You don't understand," The wet voice bubbled, closer now, sounding inside Elias's own head. "I am not the one haunting you, Elias. Look at your chest." Elias looked down. He expected to see his flannel shirt heaving with exhaustion. Instead, he saw water. A dark stain was spreading from the center of his chest, soaking through the fabric. But it wasn't sweat and it wasn't blood. It was pond water. It seeped outward, smelling of brine and decay. He touched his chest, and his fingers sank into his own flesh as if it were soft, wet clay. He wasn't just wet. He was liquefying. A cough built up in his chest, violent and uncontrollable. Elias bent over, retching, expecting bile. Instead, he vomited a stream of black, brackish water onto the mossy ground. Something wriggled in the puddle he had just expelled, a small, blind tadpole, gasping for air. Elias fell to his knees, staring at the creature he had just coughed up. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't being hunted by a monster from the pond. He was the vessel. The bloated figure walked forward, towering over him. It reached down, offering its hand, the one with the missing finger. "It's time to go back," the entity said, its voice no longer terrifying, but welcoming. "The water is rising." Elias looked up, his vision blurring as his eyes began to fill with tears that felt too thick, too viscous. He tried to speak, to beg, but his mouth filled with water again. Far off in the distance, beyond the bone gate and the breathing trees, he saw the headlights of a car cutting through the fog. A chance, a witness. But as he tried to stand, his legs gave way. They had fused together, the denim of his jeans melting into sleek, dark skin. He clawed at the ground, dragging his transforming body inch by inch toward the light, while the wet hand of his doppelganger closed gently around his ankle. The grip on his ankle was not tight, yet it was inescapable. It felt less like a hand holding him back and more like gravity itself shifting, tilting the world so that the only direction Elias could truly move was down, down into the dark, churning loam, down into the subterranean waterways that now sang to the fluid filling his lungs. He kicked out, but the motion was sluggish, underwater slow despite being on land. His legs, fused and slick with that alien mucus, felt heavy, as if the marrow inside his bones had been replaced with lead and river silt. He dragged himself forward by his elbows, his fingernails digging into the rotten G-leaf litter, tearing through moss and mud in a desperate bid for the asphalt road that lay just beyond the trees. "It hurts, I know," the voice gurgled, vibrating not in his ears but in the water that now sloshed inside his skull. The bloated figure walked alongside him, matching his agonizing crawl with a patient, leisurely stroll. "The separation always hurts. You are trying to hold on to a shape that no longer remembers you." Elias tried to scream, to tell the thing to go to hell, but his throat seized. A bubble of thick, black bile rose up, forcing his jaws apart. He retched, expelling another quart of brackish water onto the forest floor. This time, there were no tadpoles. There were teeth. His teeth. They clattered onto the roots like tossed pebbles, pearly white against the decay, pushed out by the soft gray gums of something emerging beneath them. Panic, primal and electric, surged through the fog in his mind. He didn't look back at the teeth. He fixed his eyes on the twin beams of light cutting through the mist ahead. The car. The engine's hum was a low, mechanical vibration that felt abrasive against his heightened senses. It sounded like a grinder, harsh and violent compared to the rhythmic, wet pulse of the forest. But it was humanity. It was salvation. He clawed forward, his flannel shirt tearing open as his torso expanded, the rib cage softening, widening to accommodate lungs that needed to process water, not air. The pain was distant now, a dull throb, eclipsed by the terrifying sensation of wrongness. His skin felt too tight, itching fiercely as if boiling from the inside. "They won't understand," the entity warned, its hand hovering just above Elias's back, a gesture of twisted comfort. "To them, you are the night. You are the reason they lock their doors." "No," Elias gurgled. The word was a wet rasp, barely intelligible. With a final agonizing heave, Elias dragged his mutating body over the embankment. The texture of the ground changed instantly. The soft, yielding moss gave way to the brutal, abrasive grit of asphalt. It scraped against his raw, slime-coated stomach, burning like fire, but he welcomed the pain. It was real. It was the road. The headlights were blinding now, washing out the world in stark white exposure. Elias squinted, his eyelids heavy and translucent, sliding sideways rather than blinking. He raised a hand that was now webbed, the fingers elongated and pale, to shield his eyes. The car screeched to a halt, tires locked against the pavement, the smell of burning rubber assaulting Elias's nose, overpowering the scent of the pond. For a brief, hopeful second, silence followed, broken only by the idling engine and the chaotic drumming of Elias's own transforming heart. "Help me," Elias thought, willing the words to project. "Please, God, just take me to a hospital." The driver's side door creaked open. "Jesus Christ!" A male voice trembled. "I hit a deer? I thought I saw—" Footsteps approached, crunching gravel, hesitant and fearful. A flashlight beam swung through the mist, dancing wildly before locking onto Elias. Elias tried to push himself up. He wanted to stand, to show that he was a man, a victim of something terrible. But his legs were gone. In their place was a long, muscular tail of dark, glistening flesh that trailed back down the embankment into the shadows. He was not standing. He was coiled. He looked up into the light, desperation clawing at what remained of his soul. He opened his mouth to beg, "Help me." That was what he intended to say. But the sound that erupted from his throat was not English. It was a high-pitched, shivering shriek, a sound of wet friction and predatory hunger that echoed through the trees like a siren of the damned. The man with the flashlight didn't see Elias. He didn't see the young writer who loved coffee and old books. He saw a monstrosity. He saw a pale, bloated nightmare slithering on the tarmac, its eyes vast and black, void of any white, reflecting the flashlight beam with a dull, bioluminescent malice. The man screamed, a raw, unbridled sound of terror, and scrambled backward, dropping the flashlight. The beam rolled across the asphalt, spinning wildly, creating a strobe effect in the fog. In the flashing light, Elias saw his own reflection in the chrome bumper of the car. The face staring back wasn't human. It was a mask of wet, gray cartilage. And as he watched, paralyzed by the horror of his own reflection, he saw his right hand, the one he had reached out in supplication, spasm uncontrollably. The pinky finger, necrotic and black, withered before his eyes. It snapped with a wet pop and fell onto the road, dissolving instantly into a puddle of dark water. He looked at his hand. 4 fingers remained. A sudden, violent instinct surged through his blood, an instinct that didn't belong to Elias. The smell of the man's fear wasn't repulsive anymore. It was appetizing. It smelled like sustenance. It smelled like warmth in the cold, wet dark. From the woods behind him, the other entity stepped onto the road. It didn't look at the man. It looked at Elias with something akin to pride. "Now you see," it whispered, its voice harmonizing with the thrumming of the car engine. "You were never the victim, Elias. You are the trap." The driver was fumbling for something in his jacket, a phone, a weapon, keys. Elias didn't know. But as the man turned to run, Elias felt his body coiled tight, compressing like a spring. He didn't want to lung. He wanted to cry. He wanted to go home. But the water commanded him. With a wet slap against the pavement, Elias launched himself forward, not toward the safety of the car, but toward the warmth of the screaming man. The distance between Elias and the stranger vanished not through the mechanics of running, but through a fluidity that defied physics. He did not sprint. He flowed. The air around him seemed to warp, the heavy fog parting like a curtain for an actor stepping onto a gruesome stage. Elias screamed in the quiet citadel of his mind, begging his limbs to stop, to freeze, to drop to the asphalt and surrender. "I am a writer," he pleaded to the void. "I drink hazelnut coffee. I have a sister in Vermont. I am human." But the gray cartilage that now masqueraded as his body did not care for hazelnut coffee or sisters. It cared only for the heat radiating from the man in the leather jacket. The collision was silent and wet, like a heavy stone dropped into a stagnant pond. Elias slammed into the stranger, the force of the impact knocking the wind out of the man with a guttural whoosh. They tumbled onto the tarmac, rolling into the illumination of the car's headlights. The man thrashed, his hands beating against Elias's chest. But where there should have been the resistance of bone and muscle, the man's fists sank into yielding cold dough. Elias felt the blows not as pain, but as ripples traveling through a medium of water. "Get off! Oh God, get off me!" the man shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail of primal desperation. Elias tried to pull away. He tried to say, "Run, please, run." Instead, his jaw unhinged. It was a sensation of sickening dislocation, the ligaments stretching far beyond their natural limit with the sound of tearing canvas. His mouth opened wide, wider, a cavernous maw descending upon the man's exposed neck. The smell of the stranger's terror, a sharp copper tang mixed with the musk of sweat, flooded Elias's senses, drowning out his internal protests. He didn't bite. He didn't chew. He simply absorbed. As his face pressed against the man's jugular, the skin of Elias's cheek and jaw dissolved into a corrosive slime. The man's scream was cut short, choked off by a gurgle of rising fluid. Elias felt the warmth of the life beneath him transfer into his own cold form. It rushed into him like hot tea on a winter morning, a euphoric surge of energy that silenced the weeping voice in his head. The man beneath him began to lose cohesion. The leather jacket, the jeans, the flesh, it all softened, blurring at the edges, turning into a dark, viscous slurry that Elias's pores drank greedily. It lasted only seconds, yet it felt like an eternity of intimacy. Elias knew this man's name was David. He knew David was driving home to a wife named Sarah. He knew David was afraid of the dark. And now, Elias thought with a sudden, horrifying clarity, David is the dark. The weight beneath him vanished. Elias was left lying prone on the asphalt, his chest heaving, steam rising from his slick gray skin. There was nothing left of the driver but a damp stain on the road and a set of car keys lying in a puddle of brackish water. Elias pushed himself up. His movements were smoother now, less jerky. The hunger had abated, replaced by a terrible, heavy fullness. He looked at his hand, the one that had lost a finger. A new digit was forming there, not a finger, but a translucent claw-like protrusion made of hard water and bone. "Beautiful!" The voice rasped from the edge of the light. Elias turned. The entity stood by the open door of the idling car. In the artificial light of the headlamps, the creature looked less like a monster and more like a hole in the world, a silhouette cut from the fabric of the night, filled with the static of dead channels. "What have I done?" Elias whispered. His voice sounded wrong, wet, gargling, as if his throat were full of kelp. "You have fed," the entity replied, running a long skeletal finger along the roof of the car. "You have taken the warmth you needed to survive the transition. The first feeding is always the hardest. The morality, it lingers like a bad aftertaste, but it passes." Elias looked at the empty car. The engine was still purring, on the heater blasting warm air into an empty seat. A bobblehead on the dashboard nodded rhythmically to the vibration. It was a scene of mundane normalcy, shattered by the atrocity that had just occurred. "I killed him," Elias said, the realization crashing down on him. "I ate him." "You repurposed him," the entity corrected. "He was fuel, you are the engine, and we have a long journey to the coast, Elias. The water does not like to be kept waiting." Elias staggered toward the car, catching his reflection in the side mirror again. The gray cartilage was receding slightly, flushed with a faint, stolen pink. He looked almost human again. Almost. But the eyes remained black, deep, and utterly soulless. "I won't do it again," Elias sobbed, though no tears came, only thick black drops of slime. "I'll stay here. I'll rot here." "You cannot rot. You are timeless now," the entity mocked, "and you will do it again. Because the hunger is a tide, Elias. It recedes, but it always returns, and next time it will be stronger." The entity pointed a spindly hand down the foggy road. "Look!" Elias turned. In the distance, cutting through the dense wall of fog, he saw them, blue and red lights, rotating, flashing. A siren wailed, a mournful rising and falling cry that echoed through the trees. Panic flared in Elias's chest, the old human panic of getting caught. But as the lights drew closer, painting the wet asphalt in strokes of violent color, the panic shifted. It twisted inside his gut, curdling into something else. His stomach growled, a low subterranean rumble. The warmth he had stolen from David was already fading, consumed by the cold void of his transformation. The blue and red lights didn't look like authority anymore. They didn't look like rescue. They looked like bright, colorful lures in the deep ocean. "More are coming," the entity whispered, stepping back into the shadows of the tree line, leaving Elias alone in the center of the road. "Do not let them leave, Elias. We need their vessel." Elias stood by the driver's side door of David's car. He looked at his hand, the translucent claw twitching in anticipation. He wanted to run into the woods. He wanted to hide. But the water in his veins commanded him to stand still. It commanded him to wave. As the police cruiser emerged from the fog, slowing down at the sight of the abandoned vehicle and the lone figure standing beside it, Elias raised his hand. He forced his melting face into a mimicry of a smile. He waited for the car to stop. He waited for the fresh warmth to step out into the cold. The cruiser crunched to a halt on the gravel shoulder, the sound of tires rolling over wet stones amplified in the suffocating silence of the forest. The red and blue lights continued their rhythmic assault, slicing through the fog in strobe light intervals that made the world look like a stuttering, broken film reel. For a moment, Elias felt blinded. The artificial, brilliant, stinging eyes that had grown accustomed to the ancient, murky dark. He kept his hand raised, a frozen mannequin's wave. He could feel the skin of his face tightening, the unnatural clay of his flesh straining to hold the shape of the man he used to be. Inside, the hunger coiled like a serpent, reacting to the proximity of a fresh, beating heart. It was a physical pain, a sharp cramp that demanded he lunge, tear, and consume. But the voice of the entity, the whisper of the trees themselves, held him back. Patience. It seemed to rustle through the dead leaves. The vessel. The driver's door of the cruiser opened with a heavy metallic creak. A boot, polished black leather now splattered with mud, hit the asphalt. "Step away from the vehicle," a voice commanded, authoritative and trembling with adrenaline. Elias lowered his hand. Slowly. He tried to recall the posture of a frightened victim. He slumped his shoulders, hugging his own torso as if shivering from the cold, though he felt no temperature at all. "Please," Elias croaked. His voice sounded wet, like stones grinding underwater. He cleared his throat, forcing the thick black ichor down, and tried again. "Please, officer, my friend, he's not moving." The officer stepped fully out of the car, one hand resting on the holstered firearm at his hip, the other directing the blinding beam of a heavy flashlight straight into Elias's face. Elias squinted, shielding his eyes, terrified that the light would reveal the void where his soul used to be. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer barked, closing the distance cautiously. He was an older man, gray at the temples, with the weary eyes of someone who had seen too many accidents on this cursed stretch of road. The nameplate on his chest read, "Harrison." Hurry. Sun swept the light over Elias, then toward the car where David's slumped form sat motionless in the passenger seat. The beam caught the pale waxen curve of David's neck. "What happened here? Did you hit something?" Harrison asked, his gaze flicking between Elias and the dense tree line. The officer sniffed the air, his nose wrinkling. The metallic tang of ozone and the heavy, sweet stench of rotting mulch hung thick around Elias. We got lost," Elias lied, the words flowing easier now, lubricated by the anticipation of violence. "Something ran out. We swerved. He hit his head. I can't wake him up." Harrison moved closer, his flashlight beam cutting a cone through the mist. He stopped 3 feet from Elias. "All right, stay put. Let me check on him. Do you have any ID on you, son?" "In the car," Elias whispered. The officer nodded, stepping past Elias toward the passenger door. As he passed, the proximity of the man's life force hit Elias like a physical blow. The heat radiating from Harrison's body was intoxicating. Elias could hear the rush of blood in the officer's jugular, a frantic, rhythmic thumping that drowned out the sirens. His clawed fingers twitched at his sides, the fingernails lengthening, sharpening into translucent needles. Not yet. The wind hissed. Harrison leaned into the open window of David's car, reaching out to check for a pulse. "Sir, can you hear me?" Silence. Harrison pressed 2 fingers against David's neck. He froze. He didn't just find a lack of a pulse. He found the unnatural, hollow coldness of a husk that had been drained of everything. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his fingers coated in a thin, sticky residue. "Jesus Christ!" Harrison breathed, backing away. He turned the flashlight beam onto his own hand. The residue wasn't blood. It was a gray, viscous slime. The officer spun around, his hand flying to his gun. "Step back. Put your hands on your head. Now!" But Elias hadn't stepped back. He had moved closer. In the strobe of the police lights, Elias stood unnaturally tall, his jaw unhinged slightly, revealing rows of teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "I tried to tell you," Elias said, his voice no longer human, but a chorus of damp echoes. "He wouldn't wake up. He's empty." "Get down!" Harrison screamed, drawing his weapon. He was fast, but the thing that wore Elias's skin was faster. Elias didn't run. He flowed. He closed the gap like spilling water. His hand, now a mass of pale, elongated talons, swiped the gun from Harrison's grip with bone-shattering force. The pistol clattered into the darkness of the woods. Before the officer could scream, Elias's other hand clamped over his mouth. The touch burned cold, searing Harrison's skin. Elias lifted the man off the ground as easily as a child lifting a doll. "The vessel," Elias murmured, staring into Harrison's terrified, widening eyes. "We didn't just need the food, officer. We needed the ride." Harrison struggled, kicking wildly, his boots thumping uselessly against Elias's shins. Elias felt the panic spiking the flavor of the blood, sweet and chaotic. He leaned in, inhaling the scent of the man's terror. "Don't worry," Elias whispered against the officer's ear. "You aren't going to rot here. You're going to help us leave." With a wet, sickening crunch, Elias tightened his grip. The struggle ceased instantly. Harrison's body went limp, a marionette with cut strings. Elias dropped the body onto the wet asphalt. The hunger roared in triumph, but he pushed it down. There was work to do. He looked at the police cruiser, the engine still humming, the heater blowing warm air, the radio crackling with static. "Yes," the entity purred from the shadows. "Take it. Take the shell. Take the authority." Elias knelt beside the fallen officer. He didn't eat. Instead, he placed his hands on the officer's face. The black slime from Elias's pores began to seep out, moving with intelligent purpose. It poured over Harrison's skin, sinking into his eyes, his nose, his mouth. Elias watched as his own body began to wither, the stolen biomass transferring, flowing like a river into the new container. It was an agonizing, ecstatic dissolution. Elias shed his old form like a snake shedding skin, pouring his consciousness, his hunger, and the dark will of the forest into the officer's body. Minutes later, Officer Harrison stood up. He adjusted his belt. He wiped the mud from his uniform. He checked his reflection in the side mirror of the cruiser. The face was Harrison's, rugged, graying, reliable, but the eyes were pools of obsidian, devoid of any white, swallowing the light of the sirens. He blinked, and the white returned, masking the abyss. He walked to the driver's side of the cruiser and slid in. The warmth of the heater felt divine. He picked up the radio handset. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, he said, his voice a perfect mimicry of the man who had died moments ago. "Situation is clear, just a stranded motorist. I'm bringing him in." "Copy that, Unit 4. The radio chirped back, oblivious to the doom that had just been invited into town. "Do you need a tow?" "No." The entity in the uniform smiled, glancing at the empty woods where the husk of Elias lay dissolving into the earth. "We're fully mobile, heading back to civilization now." He put the car in drive. As the cruiser pulled away, leaving the fog behind, the red and blue lights stopped flashing, replaced by the steady, predatory glow of headlights, cutting a path toward the sleeping town below. The asphalt ribbon unspooled beneath the wheels of the cruiser, a stark, gray contrast to the chaotic, tangled roots of the forest floor. For the entity wearing Officer Harrison's skin, the sensation of driving was novel, intoxicating. It accessed Harrison's memories like pulling files from a cabinet. The muscle memory of steering, the traffic codes, the layout of the sleeping town of Ashwood ahead. It felt the man's lingering anxieties, a mortgage payment, a distant daughter, and crushed them, sweeping the emotional debris aside to make room for a singular, ancient hunger. The town emerged from the mist not as a sanctuary, but as a buffet laid out in rows of neat, manicured lawns and silent houses. Streetlights flickered with a sickly sodium glow, casting long, stretching shadows that seemed to welcome the cruiser. The entity slowed the vehicle, prowling through the residential streets. It was no longer a beast of instinct, frantically chasing prey through the underbrush. It was now a wolf in the shepherd's clothing, armed with the ultimate camouflage, trust. Movement caught its eye. 2 streets down from the town square, a young woman was walking briskly, clutching her coat tight against the chill. She was alone. The entity felt a surge of dopamine, a remnant of Harrison's biology hijacked for a darker purpose. It turned the wheel, the cruiser gliding silently alongside the curb, the engine purring a low mechanical threat. The woman jumped as the window rolled down, her fear instantly replaced by a wave of visible relief when she saw the uniform, the badge, and the familiar face of the town's veteran officer. "Officer Harrison," she exhaled, her breath pluming in the cold air. "You startled me." "Sorry about that, Sarah," the entity said, plucking the name effortlessly from Harrison's memory of the town's inhabitants. The voice was gravelly, warm, and utterly convincing. "It's late. You shouldn't be out here walking alone. The woods, they aren't safe tonight." Sarah managed a nervous smile, stepping closer to the vehicle. "My car wouldn't start at the diner. I thought I could just walk it." "Nonsense," the entity chided gently. The interior lock clicked open with a sound that echoed like a trap snapping shut. "Hop in. I'll give you a ride home. Protect and serve, right?" "Thank you, I really appreciate it," she said, opening the door. As she slid into the passenger seat, the warmth of the heater enveloped her. She closed the door, sealing herself inside the metal cage. The entity watched her from the corner of its eye. It saw the pulse fluttering in her neck, the unsuspecting innocence of a lamb lying down beside the lion. "You're a lifesaver," she murmured, buckling her seatbelt. "I try," the entity replied. It shifted the car into drive, but instead of turning toward Sarah's house, it turned back toward the edge of town, where the streetlights ended and the encroaching darkness began. "Officer?" Sarah asked, a tremor of confusion entering her voice. "My house is the other way." The entity turned its head. The dashboard lights cast deep shadows across Harrison's rugged features. For a fleeting second, the camouflage slipped. The whites of the eyes vanished, replaced by a bottomless, oily black void that swirled with the memories of 1,000 devoured souls. The smile that spread across the officer's face was too wide, stretching the skin beyond human limits. "We have a detour to make," the thing that was not Harrison whispered. "I'm not the only one who is hungry." Sarah's scream was cut short as the cruiser accelerated, its taillights dissolving into the heavy, suffocating night. The town of Ashwood slept on, silent and ignorant, unaware that the monster was no longer under the bed or in the closet. It was behind the wheel, wearing a badge, and the long, terrifying night had only just begun.